In the AWS Developers Podcast, today we're talking about local unit testing for your steps function. Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you for downloading the AWS Developers Podcast wherever you are on this planet. Every Friday morning European time, Friday evening if you're more on the east side, or during your night, you have new episodes in your podcast application, in all good podcast application, Spotify, Deezer, YouTube, Apple Podcast, you name it. As I used to say, if it is a good podcast application, there is a good chance that you can find the AWS Developers Podcast. Talk about the podcast to your colleagues, to your friends, leave us feedback, leave us some stars or your thumbs up. That's how we get noticed in the community as well. Every Friday morning, we talk about technology, services, tools, frameworks that matters for developer and developers on AWS. Today, we're talking about Step Function with Jas Narula, your product manager in the Step Function team based out of Vancouver in Canada. Thank you for joining this show, Jas. Maybe let's start with a very generic and broad question to allow everybody to catch up. What are step functions?
Thanks for having me here, Seb, and hi, everyone. So Step Functions, what is it? Step Functions is a serverless product. What that means is the infrastructure is managed by AWS, so you don't have to worry about the underlying mechanics of how the resources are managed. But bottom line, the value prop that it offers to customers is it's an easy way to hook up different microservices and orchestrate your end-to-end workflow. That workflow could be a business process, it could be an IT process. The typical persona using step functions is a developer or a platform architect who weaves or integrates different microservices together. And you also have the added benefit of a visual canvas builder through which you can drag and drop different services and actually see and communicate with different teams across your organization to show what that process looks like. And then you can go and build it.
That was a game changer because when we introduced step functions a couple of years back, I remember we had to define the workflow in a text file, like a YAML file. And now we can visually drag and drop components. We have a palette of components. We drag them. We draw lines in between them. We can express that we want components to run in parallel or to wait for something or a condition, all that graphically. And AI tools are really good at generating a step function as well. If you describe what you want, they can generate that for you. So that's really a game changer. And you can even use that within your IDE. If I remember well, there is a plugin inside Visual Studio Code, for example, to define your step functions.
That's right. Yeah, we launched it earlier this year, and we've received good feedback from the customers. The intent was to get closer to where customers build code, and it is the IDE, so we launched that visual builder experience in the IDE. I'm actually a big fan of the IDE experience of the visual builder experience. You know, as they say, picture speaks 1,000 words. It does that to me.
It's easier to communicate with the rest of the team for sure. When step function was launched, in my mental model, it was mostly a way to coordinate execution of Lambda function. Like I have a Lambda function to do that. I have another one to do that. And that was an easy way to coordinate the execution of that. But it goes ways above just coordinating Lambda function, correct? I can call directly some AWS API also.
Yes. So well, short answer is yes. It does go beyond Lambda functions, but today Lambda still happens to be one of the highest invocation targets from step functions. Now, having said that, we've seen customers using step functions to call in, of course, Lambda functions, but beyond Lambda functions, with the advent of agentic applications, we have seen customers using step functions to invoke Bedrock APIs, for example, for data summarization, intelligent data processing, for example, and that's an emerging pattern. Bedrock APIs, but beyond Bedrock APIs, there are other AWS services or even third-party APIs that you can invoke through the HTTPS task state that we have in Step Functions.
Oh yes, it's not limited to AWS anymore. And calling Bedrock is super interesting. That's something I have in my bucket list of things to do when I will have time one day for this podcast, for example. I would like whenever there is a new MP3 file arriving on my S3 bucket to trigger a workflow that will transcribe So give a text representation of what we said, and then summarize it, and then generate the web page and generate the message on social media and things like that. That's the type of things we can do with Step Function. I also remember when I was younger, it was quite common for large enterprise to think about business process. And there were a large company with a blue or red logo trying to sell multi-million software, middleware, to manage the business process inside an organization. Is it something, customers are using Step Function too, as well? Or is it more like for technical coordination of different services?
It is still the latter, technical coordination of different services, and that's primarily because the persona for which this product was designed or is designed is a developer persona. So you need to have an AWS account, for example. Now, having said that, these developers could be either from a platform teams, or they can be a line of business developer who are tasked to automate the business process. So there are business processes being orchestrated by step functions. A good example is, imagine a company who is using step functions to send out alerts to their end customers in an event. For example, if the order was submitted, you send an email, for example. So you can use step function to orchestrate. So at the end of the day, it's still a business process orchestrated by step functions, but the actual users of the product are still a developer persona. It's a developer persona or an architect persona. Those are the two primary people that I've seen actually using this product.
People having their hands on an AWS account, and that's why it's not used. It could be used, but it's not too much use for business process, unless we refer as business process like the checkout of an online website or a payment, the coordination between all that. That's already some part of the business as well. So as a developer, I'm developing my step function locally. So far, the easiest way to test is to deploy. And then I remember in the console, there is like a graphical user experience. I can see the state transition and like putting a breakpoint in my step function literally and observe CloudWatch logs to see what's happening. But what if I want to test locally on my laptop? There was a solution. I think it's not actively maintained anymore. So that's the starting point for this podcast episode. What do you want to propose to developers for local development?
Yeah, that's a great point. The inner loop experience for developers, we've been making some investments. We made some investments this year actually, and to answer your specific question on the developers who are building their workflows locally, how do we enable testing for those workflows? We had for the right reasons, we had good intentions when we launched Step Functions Local a few years back. Now, what is Step Functions Local? Step Functions Local is a utility, or it was a container that contains our runtime, Step Functions runtime, which you can download on your local machine as a developer. What that does is, when you build your workflow definition and you want to test it, you can run that container, which mimics or emulates Step Functions environment, not exactly the same, but it would emulate the environment, which allows you to execute your workflows locally, test it. We've also seen customers using the Step Functions local container as a part of the CI/CD pipeline, as a part of their automated deployment process. When we launched it, we had the good intentions, and it solved the need at the time when this product was launched. But as always, we always keep our eyes and ears open, listening to customer feedback, and we have learned from customers that the customers wanted more from Step Functions Local, more from a utility that allows them higher fidelity testing. Also, we learned over the course of time that maintaining two different runtimes for one product is not easy.
Yeah, that's twice the work for the
Twice the work.
team.
Exactly. And what ended up happening was, the pace of innovation at which we were introducing features and step functions, it was hard to keep the same pace on the local runtime that we had.
And to keep the parity between the new functionalities in the real service in the cloud and the local container.
Right, exactly. And for that reason, we decided to discontinue support for Step Functions Local last year in 2024, with an intent that we want to come up with a solution for our developers which is sustainable, scalable, and gives customers what they're looking for, an improved inner loop experience. And very recently,
That sounds good on paper, and that's what your team launched a few weeks ago, depending when you're listening to this episode. So, what is the new solution?
oh, thanks for asking. So, uh, we have changed. So we thought hard on what is the best way in which we can solve this problem for the longer term, giving customers what they needed as a part of the inner loop developer experience. And what we have done now is we we had so stepping back, even before we launched this enhancement, we had this thing called test state. People who are listening to this podcast who use step functions today, they may be familiar with this feature on the console. There's this thing called test state button. When you click the test state button, what it essentially does is it takes the state that you're testing. It takes the ASL for that state, executes it on the AWS production runtime, and returns you the results. So what we have done, and that feature is also available as an API call. What we have done now is we have invested in enhancing the test state API in a way that developers can now use the test state API as a part of their automated local unit testing. And I'm going to talk about the features that make that happen, but that's what we launched very recently, which basically means that in the past, customers who were using the container-based testing through Step Functions Local, and in some cases, they were blocked because some features are not available on Step Functions Local. For example, if your workflow uses JSON was not launched, is not supported in Step Functions Local, and in the absence of customers would have to deploy their workflow to the AWS account and test it. And guess what happens when you test? You have bugs.
It's not exactly the same. So you
Yes,
don't have
and
this. Yeah, some complex component like the map component that allows
yes,
to spread out a call to multiple thread. I don't know how to define that. Was not available in local test anymore. So at the heart of what you're launching, it's an API that allows to test in the cloud on the same execution environment your local step function. Does that mean that I need a network connection to unit test or to test locally my test function?
that's right. Yeah. So the way you described is exactly right. It is an API-based approach. We have made those changes in the last few days, and we launched those when we announced those enhancements. They're currently available only through an API. In the
Mm-hmm.
future, we can talk about the enhancements that we plan to have a seamless experience both on the console or on the API. But we prioritize API because that's what developers are going to be using for automating the local unit test. Now, do you need a network connection? Yes, because you're calling a production runtime on an AWS endpoint, a remote endpoint. You will need network access in your developer environment to be able to use the tested API. Now, having said that, I also acknowledge that some customers might not have uh, network access in their dev environment, in certain environments where they actually want to run their tests, or it might just be a preference to run their tests in an isolated environment where there's no network access available. And for that, what we have done is we have partnered up with LocalStack. Um, LocalStack is a vendor that specializes in emulating AWS environment in a container-based support. You can just download that on your machine, which basically is your local AWS cloud, where you can run your applications. We partnered with them. What that means is that when we launched the the enhancements to the test state API, you will also find the same enhancements in the
On
tested
local
API
stack.
on LocalStack Cloud.
So
So we have catered to both. We give customers options. If a customer has no limitation on the network access, you can use the remote endpoint from AWS, which is same production runtime as what's used for running your production workloads. Or if you have a preference of using a local environment, you can change that endpoint to a LocalStack Cloud.
that's ideal for me because I'm traveling a lot, so I'm often developing in a train or in a plane with at best intermittent network connection. But as you mentioned, some large enterprises have security rules that also say that their local environment must be network isolated. What is the developer experience? I'm a developer. I've developed my step function. I guess I need to download the ESL, so the step function definition, the text file, and then what?
So you'll think about in terms of the experience, this is now brings this approach, an API-based testing approach, brings you to the same. This allows you to get to a test-driven development, like what you've been doing for other applications, for other services. You can write your test. Uh, uh, we have documentation that we have updated, where you can find the details of the tested API enhancements. Specifically, we have updated the request model and the response model. There is a lot of goodies that we've added in the test state, both in the request and response, that allows you as a developer to build your assertions um, across different parts of your workflow. Uh, the working backwards that we had was the intent is not for you to test the actual service integration. You can if you want to, but the enhancements are designed in a way that allows you
For
to
unit
validate
tests.
your work,
Hmm.
yeah, for unit testing
Hmm.
of your workflow definitions, uh, test your state transitions, test your error handling. What happens if my service integration returns a specific type of an error? Is my workflow able to handle it gracefully? So you can validate all that. And in terms of getting
As,
started, sorry.
as a developer, when I write tests, typically I write a payload or a request, as you said, something to input into my system. I call the system, and then I run a couple of tests on the output, assertions, as you mentioned, to verify that the output is what I expect. So, what is the developer experience for step function?
So because we're now talking about an API-based approach, the benefit of an API-based approach is you as a developer can now use any testing framework that you currently use for managing your test suite. Um, you can use that as long as you can call an API. You can integrate these tests into your current testing framework. So be it
That's
PyTest
excellent. Hmm.
or Jest. We have also published an example client library using PyTest on our GitHub link, which gives you some handy functions which accelerate your development when you're writing those tests. So, for example, some boilerplate code that you might have to write without those libraries,
Hmm.
we have some helper functions that we have demonstrated through PyTest that you can use to either reuse those functions, or if you're using Jest or some other framework, you can easily replicate them to fast track your test development cycles.
So now I can write unit tests for my step function using that Python library that you mentioned. And by the way, the link are in the notes of this podcast. So if you scroll down a bit the page of your podcast application, you will find a link to the GitHub repo, to the doc that Jas is talking about, and to the blog post that my colleague Donny wrote to explain the launch of that new capability.
Yes, that's accurate. You can totally use those helper functions to fast track your development, your test development. Some examples would be in the past, for example, test state. Before we launch these enhancements, test state only allowed you to test one state at a time. Now we understand that you may want to kind of cycle through your entire states, all the states in your state machines. We have changed that request. One ways in which we have changed the test state request model is now we allow you to pass the full ASL, and you can specify that you want to test this state. One of the outputs of the test state response is going to be the next state. You can use the next state to chain your workflows and assert wherever you want to assert in your test case. And for that chaining, you have a function that you can use, so you don't have to build your own boilerplate code just to chain step functions. And like that, there's a bunch of other functions, helper functions that we have launched, that we have made available in that GitHub repo that you can use to
Let
fast
me
track your
rephrase
development.
to be sure I understand correctly. So, as a developer, either I can decide to test my step function end to end from the beginning to the end, or to test individual state transitions, so individual nodes in my workflow. And in between each of these, I can inject my own assertion to validate that the output of one node, one state, is correct before passing it to as input to the next node.
That's exactly right. You can test one state at a time. You can test your entire workflow. And thirdly, you can also test portion of your workflow. So those helper functions, one of the helper function is I want to my start my execution at step number 3 of my workflow and go all the way to step number 5. This is the input for step number 3. So those helper functions allow you to test portions of your workflow as well, if that's what you want to focus as a part of your sessions.
As you said at the beginning, in a step function workflow, as a developer, I can choose to call S3 API or any AWS, not any, most of the AWS API, hundreds of AWS API, S3, DynamoDB, Bedrock, as you mentioned. If I want to do unit testing, I probably don't want to call these. So while I'm testing the state transition in the cloud, can I mock these services as well?
Absolutely, and that's one of the bigger enhancement that are a part of this launch that we recently announced on the test state API. You can absolutely mock. We've added mocking capabilities as a part of your request, the tested API request model. We've also given, so the working backwards, going back to what I was talking about earlier, we want to give as higher fidelity experience to customers who are building those tests and running those tests on their local machines. So the degree of surprises that customers may get when they deploy their workflows to the AWS account, we want to minimize that. One way to do that is using the same production runtime, which is a tested API. Now, how do we bring the same working backwards towards the mocking experience? So while we have introduced mocking support in the tested API request model, we are giving customers option to specify what kind of mock. So when you define a mock, you're defining a mock for the response for the service that you're calling instead of calling the actual service.
So
Now,
that the response will simulate what the service would respond. So I provide a hard-coded response for my test, saying, "Hey, if I call S3, this is the response I'm expecting back from S3."
exactly. Now you can mock a success response, you can mock an error response. But when you're defining a response, let's take your example, Seb. We're talking about S3. If you're calling a specific S3 service and it has a specific response model, ideally you want to define your mock response in a way that matches the same response model for that API that you're calling from Step Functions. What we have done as a part of this mocked feature in tested API is you have, as a customer, you have an option of specifying what is the level of mock response validation that you want to make. By default, we set that to strict. What that means is if you're calling an AWS service, and if that AWS service has 5 different parameters in the request model that's tasked as mandatory, the strict validation makes sure that your mock response matches the mandatory fields and the shape of those fields exactly to the T of what the AWS API model dictates. And that's one of the best practices that I would advise to have higher fidelity tests. So your tests and your workflow can handle the exact same mock response as what an actual AWS service would respond. Now, if you don't want to do it, and customers might prefer in some cases to not do a strict validation because of they may want a faster iteration as they're building something, you have options. We've added by default it's strict validation, but you can change that to a lenient validation, which is called the present, or no validation at all. What present basically does is it only validates the responses or the requests that are in your mock response, nothing else. While strict, make sure all the required parameters are present. Present only validates what's present in your mock response, and none validates nothing. So we give you options on the entire spectrum. The best practices being use the default value.
And for the payload itself, is it something that the developer must provide? Like I have to provide you a copy paste of the response from I'm expecting from S3, or is it something that the service generates for me?
We are starting off with the former, where the developer would be providing the mock response. But we have some goodies coming up after the initial launch, which will make it easier for our developers to use pre-formatted responses as an example.
Yeah, they are typically, without knowing anything about how it works now, it's either the developer providing the JSON, either there is a recording capability where I can go through real execution first and record the response and record them for my test, or the service can generate a mock response by
That's right.
itself. So that's what is the approach
Oh,
that will
sorry,
be that is available now at
oh,
launch?
I missed that. Sorry. It's the first one that you said, where the
Okay.
developer has to provide the response payload as a part of this launch. And we will, as last time, we will be keeping our eyes and ears open, and we'll make this experience better based on customer feedback.
What is the tool I can use from my laptop? Is it a new command line option or an extension to the Visual Studio Code developer? I can start unit tests from a graphical user interface.
Not on the workflow builder. You can of course use the CLI. We have
Mm-hmm.
made these changes available in the SDK, so you can use our enhanced test state SDK to call this API and its features for this API as a part of your test suite that you're building in any framework.
And because it's an API, I just need IAM authorization, just like for any other API. I need to be authorized to make that API call. It means that my CI chain, because I'm thinking about what you said about CI, also needs to have proper authorization to call that new API.
Yes, but we've also made it easier because we understand having the right set of permissions at the time of testing may slow down development. So when you're mocking your service integration responses, we have made the IAM roles optional, because you may want to do it as a best practice when you're doing integration testing. You may want to validate those behaviors then, but as a part of your inner loop experience as a developer, you may just want to bypass that, as you're not actually calling the AWS service, you're mocking them. So when you're mocking them, your IAM role is optional.
I'm trying still to understand the developer experience, and I'm back to the unit testing framework. So the most likely way to get started with this as a developer, if I have a Python project, I take the library that you talk about, and I use that to build my regular PyTest unit testing
That's right.
for the different state transition I want to test.
That's right. Yes.
And if it is not Python, I can integrate probably the same way inside JavaScript or other language unit testing framework, except that we don't have your library yet. So I'm down to the API level using whatever SDK is available for my programming language.
That's correct. The idea behind providing this library for PyTest was to give an idea of how customers can use this as a guidance to build their libraries for any other testing framework that they would like to. It's pretty straightforward, but we wanted to provide like an on-ramp or an easy
Mm-hmm.
getting started
Easy
path
way. Mm-hmm.
of, in the case of, if you're using Python, this is how you can do it. But if you're using JavaScript or any other language, you can just replicate the same functions libraries that we have for
Mm-hmm.
PyTest in any other language.
And I guess the
So,
community will come very quickly with a JavaScript, a Java, a C# equivalent
oh,
library.
100%. I've already been talking to some customers, and they may be on the way of building some libraries for themselves. So you'll see something published
Probably very soon as well.
very soon. Yes.
Is there anything developers should know, should especially take care about, something that maybe will not work or is not supported today? Any pitfall to avoid?
So in the before we launched these enhancements, test state in its previous form didn't support certain types of advanced states. For example, the map state wasn't
Mm-hmm.
supported, the paddle state wasn't supported, activity wait for task token is not supported. And as a part of these enhancements, as I was saying earlier, we want to unlock this or unblock customers from writing the unit test for the entire workflow. In the past, it wasn't possible because there were certain capabilities that are needed for writing those local unit tests, one of them being mocking checked off. Certain states were not supported. We've added those states now. We've added the support for those states in the enhanced test state API. What that means is now you can test activity state, you can test map state or paddle states or wait for task token or dot sync. But in order for you to test these states, it's very important that you use these states in conjunction with a mock response. You have to, if you don't provide a mock response, you'll get a validation error. And the reason being that, going back to what are we actually testing? We are unit testing my control flow logic of my workflow. So if in my state I'm calling a wait for task token, I don't want to actually wait for the task token to come in, someone approving my given request. I have to mock it, so I can go back to my control flow logic and see what happens to my control flow logic based on the response I'm mocking. So all this to say that the states, the advanced states that were not supported in the past in test state, which are now supported, will be supported in conjunction with the mock response. So you got to keep that in mind. And for the map states, we've added some new parameters in the inspection level, in the inspection debug, in the debug level, that allows you to run your assertions on data transformations. And you'll get details about all those parameters in the tested API documentation. But to name a few, you
Yeah,
can run.
can you give a couple of examples?
Yes. So to name a few, let's say that you have an items path that you use in your map state,
Mm-hmm.
and you want to see the data transformation that happened after the state or your input passed through the items path. We have added after items path, that will show you the transformed data, and then you can run your assertions on it. And like that, we've added a few other new debug inspection level items in the tested API response, which again, the focus is to allow customers to validate their workflow logic, data transformations, and error handling logic, which is core to an orchestration.
Earlier in this conversation, you mentioned JSON data as well. It's a query path for JSON document that was not supported in the previous testing tool, and you said it's supported now, so I can write JSON data expression to validate the response coming from the tool.
Yes. So the good news is that the JSON data support was available in the tested even before we launched the enhancements, and that's going to continue as is even with these new enhancements as customers increasingly adopt JSON data based state machine definitions.
At AWS, we also invented James path as a way to query JSON. So why two different standard JSON data on one side, James path on the CLI and the Python SDK, for example?
So if I understand the question, you're asking why both JSON path and JSON data?
Yeah.
So it's giving customers an option. Customers ask for more flexibility to do more in a given state. With JSON path, you can do a lot, but you need to have a few states. Versus in JSON data, you can do basic expression evaluation in a given state without having to write a separate state and a Lambda function. So it allows customers to do more with less.
So it's more expressive.
It's more expressive, exactly.
I'm usually saying to customer that anything that puts some pressure on our infrastructure has a cost for them. So my next question is about pricing. It's a remote API. It has some execution on our side. So what is the price for these new API?
We are not going to be charging customers to use the tested API like how it's been in the past before these enhancements were launched. And the idea is that we want to provide customers the confidence that they need as they're building their workflows. So when those workflows are deployed in the AWS account, they the ideal state is that the bugs that you cannot discover locally are the ones that you should discover if at all when you're doing integration testing in the AWS account. And we are offering this at no additional cost to customers for running tested API. There's of course, because it's an API call, it has fair usage policy. We've increased the TPS from what it was when these enhancements were not available, which was 1 TPS, to a high TPS limit, keeping in mind that customers would be using this for their integration tests and the
Yeah, for
regression tests.
CI, the transaction per
Exactly.
second can increase quite
But
dramatically.
yes, but to answer your question, there is no additional cost for the base feature set that we have launched as a part of this enhancement for testing.
So that's an excellent use. And it makes sense. It's a developer tool. It helps me to develop step functions. So I will be charged for my step function in production or even end-to-end testing and things like that, but not for the development process itself. I think it's a good developer experience to make these tools available for free. And you said it's a fair use policy, so there is a higher limit probably on the number of API calls I can do per account, per day, per hour, per month. I don't know. But is it a hard limit, or is it something a customer can increase through a call to the support if they need higher level transaction?
Yeah, so it is not a hard limit. We want to be fair to all the customers who are using these capabilities, but we also acknowledge that some customers' workloads are much bigger than the others, and in that case, customers can reach out to us, and we'll evaluate that on a case-by-case basis, and where possible, we'll consider increasing the limit.
What are the trends you're seeing in serverless testing? You talk about LocalStack. Now we introduce this new capability. Obviously, the world of testing serverless solution is very different now in 2025, 2026 soon than it used to be like 10 years ago.
So the biggest trend that we have seen is the serverless experience moving from cloud to the IDE. You've seen that with some of the launches that we had earlier in the year with Lambda, where we introduced
breakpoint in your Lambda function.
That's exactly right. So the serverless experience is coming closer to where developers are on their IDEs, on the local machines, and that's what is also something that you have seen earlier in the year and with this launch, where we are getting this more of those capabilities and feature sets closer towards customers' IDE and the inner loop experience. So, for example, you mentioned that earlier, Seb, that the workflow studio, the visual builder that we had on the console, we brought that to the IDE earlier in the year. So customers who are using IDE, the VS Code, for example, they through the AWS Toolkit VS Code plugin, they can use the workflow builder on their local machines. Now we have this local testing experience through tested API. Albeit the runtime is remote, but you don't have to deploy anything to your AWS account. You can do everything on your local machine by remotely invoking the endpoint, executing your tests, getting the results on your local machine, running your assertions, running them again, finding bugs, fixing it. Once you're happy, confident, you deploy that to the cloud, do your integration tests. So the biggest trend that we've seen is coming closer to the developers on their local machines and getting that experience what they had on the console on their IDE.
What is the first step you would recommend to developer to take after listening to this podcast to get started? Is it downloading the library? Is it something else?
The first thing I'd say is this tested API feature set, the enhancement that we've recently introduced, has a lot of goodies. And the best way to get started is I'd suggest to go read the documentation to understand and get a mental model of using these enhancements, how to write my test. Because this is a difference in a way customers have been testing have been using step functions local in the past, but which was a container-based testing approach. In step functions local, the way customers could mock their services is different than the capabilities that we've launched through these enhancements. So the best way to kind of build a mental model is to go read the documentation where we've given some examples. I'd also suggest to have a look at the client, the Java, the Python libraries, the Python client libraries, which will also give an idea of, okay, this is how I can, those pre-built functions gives an idea of how can I think about writing those test cases for my workflows. So those two things are a good starting point to build a mental model, how to think about it. And then of course you should go and download the SDK so you can start building.
Yeah, update your CLI, update your SDK to get the new API available. All links that you talk about, so the GitHub link to the library, the links to the exact page in the documentation are in the notes of this podcast. You just have to scroll down a bit in your app or on the website, and you will find the links to give you some reading for the weekend to build that mental model to start unit testing your step function. Thank you, Jas Narula, your product manager in the step function group, based in Canada, in Vancouver. Thank you for having joined the podcast today. Thank you for having listened to this episode until the end. See you next week. But now you go build your step function, of course.